Did you ever wonder where New York has buried much of its population over the centuries? Well, the simple answer is Hart Island. You see, amid the large and densely populated city of New York, with over 8 million permanent residents, plus tourists and migrants, the city has dozens of public and private cemeteries. And as the population grew over time, many reached their total capacity. In a city like this, burials must be carefully planned or the system can be overwhelmed. Hence this small, almost barren rock known as Hart Island has long been the solution to that problem. But why are there abandoned buildings here, and what was this island before it became a cemetery? Well, the answer might shock you. Today, we discover Hart Island. I'm your host, Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. Hart Island is a 131-acre island in the Long Island Sound, just within sight of the Bronx and the nearby City Island. Well, New York gave it many uses. Its early history was a string of transfers from one owning family to another. These families often used the island as a hideaway for the less savory aspects of city life, such as bare-knuckle boxing. And some of these fights were well documented in local newspapers, such as the boxer Tom Barrett, aka Long Tem, and Def Burke in as late as 1849. One match in 1842 even attracted around 6,000 spectators from some of New York's most reputable communities. It was such a spectacle that the New York Daily Herald counted 9 different steamboats ferrying visitors to the island. Things eventually changed as plots of the island were purchased by the New York government. The first use of the island as public land was as a garrison and training camp for the Union Army's 31st Infantry in 1864 and throughout the American Civil War. Later, it would also hold over 3,000 Confederate prisoners of war before their release after the end of the conflict. The island was officially sold in its entirety to the local government following the war, and public use of the land skyrocketed in a series of increasingly bizarre tasks. The first effort was as a workhouse and trade school for negligent and truant boys across the boroughs, eventually expanding into a separate men's labor house. The island eventually also housed a women's psychiatric hospital, rehabilitation house for heavy drinkers, and a quarantine camp during the yellow fever outbreak. There was one businessman named Solomon Riley who attempted to open an amusement park on the island. It was meant for the predominantly African American community in Harlem, as at the time they were banned from the more popular Coney Island further outside the city. However, after much of the work was finished, including a boardwalk, dance hall, and even boarding houses, his plans to have a grand opening on the 4th of July, 1925 were killed by the city government, who condemned the park facilities before they could even open. A legal battle ensued, ending with the Rileys recovering $144,000 from the state. During World War II, it was used as a Navy barracks for the surge in the Navy's manpower and continued as a limited military base through the early Cold War. The military constructed hidden Nike missile silos on the island for the integrated defense of New York and commissioned the ground in 1955. However, it was closed and relocated within 6 years. Unfortunately, it's unclear as to what became of the lost silos. Even so, none of these increasingly random and bizarre facts would be what made the island so grimly famous. The first people to be documented as buried on the island were cadets of the 31st Infantry and Confederate POWs who all died of camp diseases. After the war, the first civilian buried on the island was Louise Van Slyke, who died of tuberculosis in Charity Hospital on Blackwell's Island. Sadly, she was an elderly immigrant, and as no one could claim her, she was buried in what would eventually be named City Cemetery or Potter's Field. In a way, her death set the trend that most other burials would follow. Most buried on Hart Island are orphans, widows, migrants, or the bereft. Remains that lay unclaimed in New York City morgues are sent here and buried orderly and systematically. By 1958, less than a century later, Hart Island interned over 500,000 deceased people. Fortunately, however, as time passed and the city grew into the metropolis we know it as today, so did medical science and identity registry. So burials on the island slowed to less than 2,000 a year before the 2010s. Remains were frequently difficult to request for private burials, even very early in the saga. And that seems to have always been the case. One man, John Rooney, made the papers in December of 1878 over the legal battle he had to claim his departed wife's body. Informed of her death only by consumption on Christmas, he desperately wanted the closure of a private burial. However, since she was a tuberculosis victim, the fight wasn't an easy one. Multiple figures that should have shared responsibility for burials and death certificates claimed they didn't have the original, drawing things out even further. It was only by administrative intervention that he could bury her in private. Others, such as John P. Burke, an American Army veteran of the First World War, wouldn't be so lucky. In 1922, he was identified by his family by his fingerprints and revealed to be buried on the island. Like many, the cause of death was never found, and the family was devastated that their son has ended up in a pauper's grave. Even the prisoners responsible for burying people here aren't immune to this system or the trauma. Accounts for the laborers showed an ugly, almost unbelievable truth from being taken to the island in handcuffs on prison buses, sometimes fearing what would happen if the ferry sank, and often not even knowing what the day's labor would entail. The first clue before the guards tell them what their job will be is the stench. I couldn't imagine how anyone in their position could deal with seeing something like that only to return to a prison cell, especially since prisoners are the people most likely to end up in a similar grave. From the 20th century on, a series of ownership changes for the island somehow ended up with it being left under the jurisdiction of New York City's Department of Corrections. Systematic neglect became more evident after this responsibility shift. Buildings began to rot and decay, battered by seasonal storms and a lack of maintenance. The island started deteriorating so severely that the problems became impossible to ignore. Hurricane Sandy in 2012 was a terrible experience for most of the city, with flooding points across the 5 boroughs and the Long Island Sound. For Hart Island, issues were even more severe. Sure, it had damaged buildings, but those were a far more manageable problem than the surge damage. You see, the hurricane badly battered Hart Island's seawall. The management and nonprofits responsible for the islands openly claimed that parts of the shore were weathered so severely that multiple caskets and the lost souls that were once within them were unearthed and exposed to the sun and sea. Further claims state that remains had been washed ashore across the Long Island Sound. By now, profound changes needed to be made. They were held back for years, to the point where the Daily Mail was still reporting on bones jutting out from the earth in 2018. As management and funding issues persisted, it was clear that the current system couldn't continue as was. So in 2019, New York State and federal government funding were issued for bolstering the seawall and destroying condemned buildings. However, despite everything, this would not be the end of the story. After the emergency of the pandemic in late 2019, infections and cases skyrocketed in New York City. Eventually, funerals and cemeteries would be taxed by the virus as well. This is probably why most of you have heard about Hart Island at some point in the past. In a desperate but calculated decision, with morgues and funeral homes over capacity across the city, the New York government made Hart Island the primary burial site for the pandemic's victims. By October 2020, 2,009 New Yorkers were buried here. They were buried together, row on row, 3 pine boxes atop one another, side by side, in gaping trenches. Many did have families, but the situation was so critical that they were buried before the authorities could find them. Other families were informed but didn't have the economic means to afford a private burial. Thus, while many of the dead were eventually identified and connected with their families, a significant portion remains on the island, making visitation almost impossible. Access to the island was also limited and only accessible by a single ferry route from City Island. During the height of the outbreak, however, that too was basically non-existent. Most people observing these burials were prisoners or a small number of professional excavators. Before as much was known about the virus as we know now, healthcare and social service workers feared it might linger on the dead, so visitation and viewing were systematically denied. Even the prisoner laborers wore full hazmat suits while performing the burials. Burials are regularly continued in the dozens each day, as recalled by Time magazine stating, quote, "The trench was supposed to last us a whole year. Instead, it was full within 2 months." However, positive changes were made for the island even during the epidemic. Funding was increased and responsibility for operations began to shift to the Department of Recreation. By late 2020, inmate labor was canceled after an outbreak among the work detail led to a spread through the prison and the supervising corrections officers, including Captain Thompson. City workers were briefly considered, but only some would knowingly accept the task. Instead, contract workers were hired. This too was resisted, as out of the 40 workers who arrived on day one, ignorant of the job ahead, 28 left immediately after learning what their assignment would entail. Much of what I've described here has been common knowledge or at least public information. Despite this, many people are unaware of this unusual history, a notion that the Hart Island project is changing. Joel Steinfeld and Melinda Hunt began photography and research on the island in 1991 for the publication of a book on lost American landscapes. They became deeply attached to the island in their 3 years of study and photo shoots. Many of the changes made for the sake of the island and the people who have someone buried there were only possible because they founded this organization, published the stories of the lost, and refused to let their memories go. The reforms that got the island out of the control of the Department of Corrections bolstered the seawall and demolished derelict buildings because of their effort and dedication. So I couldn't let their hard work go without acknowledgement here. Leaders of the Hart Island Project and other current and former members of the city government agreed that for change to be made, the island needs to be open. While technically publicly accessible year-round now, the only route available, as of last year, was still the City Island Ferry. While appointments are no longer mandatory, City Island is still a relatively remote and low-population area of the city, out of the way for many New Yorkers who live closer to Manhattan or Brooklyn. Alternatives have been planned, but they have not yet been put into action. So unfortunately, I can't offer much closure on accessing the cemetery, even if you already live nearby. So now that we have a better understanding for this island's history, let's take a look at what remains today. Some of the abandoned buildings on the island, such as the chapel and cottage, have been designated for restoration and repurposing for public use. The chapel, located near the cemetery of the island, was built in the 1930s and is the island's most prominent landmark. It's a Gothic-style building with a beautiful stained glass window and is currently being restored. The cottage, a small house located on the island's eastern shore, was used as a residence for workers on the island in the past. It's also being restored and will serve as a visitor center for the island. Other abandoned buildings on the island, such as the former hospital, prison, and tuberculosis sanatorium, are not open to the public due to safety concerns and their state of disrepair. Hart Island reflects the grimmest reality of city life. For people who are overlooked, who perhaps lived in the gutter only to end up in the potter's field. But this story is far from unique. In fact, it's not even the most interesting of its kind. For example, in Paris, authorities solved their grave overflow issues by moving millions of people into over 200 miles of deep tunnel under the city. But that's a story for another video, and if you'd like to watch it, click here. Otherwise, hit that subscribe button or support us by clicking join to access the members area. Until next time, this is Ryan Socash, signing off.